One day I was researching my last Civil War book, and I was up in a sizable town in northern Vermont. And I love libraries, and I stopped at the library to look for some information, and I walked in the front door, said, "Where's your Vermont room?" A young lady showed me, and as she was walking toward the room, she turned around, looked at me, and she said, "Oh, you are a well-known writer." And I said, "Well, you know, some people do." She said, "Do you mind if I get the staff down here to meet you?" And I said, "Yeah, okay, fine. Let me go to your room, and I'll meet you at the front desk." And 15 minutes I went down. And there were 6 or 7 people there, and she said, "Oh, we are so lucky to have a really good writer here today. I want you all to meet Joe Citro." I think I called Joe and told him that story, but I love it. Anyway, but that is not the subject tonight. The subject is a heavy one. How many of you have read this book, The Light Pirate? Put it on your list. I read this about 6 months ago. This is as good a book as I've read in 10 years. You can't put it down, and when you finish, you'll be so educated about climate change that it'll change your life. An amazing book, The Light Pirate, by Lily Brooks Dalton, who'll spend some time in Vermont, I'm told. We'll be getting into that later. The Year Without a Summer. What an awful night to have to talk about cold. Lore, lore of the mountains, lore of the deep hills, the ravines, lore of the big lake. I grew up with Vermont lore back on the edge of the age of television, before television came. Thank God. I grew up in Woodstock. And in the middle of the green where the paths crossed, a long time ago it was said somebody buried the heart of a vampire there. And 100 years later, somebody dug down where those paths crossed to see if there was anything left there, and they got down 2 or 3 feet and sulfurous fumes began to rise. They stopped digging. I spent much of my childhood in the town just to the west of Woodstock, Bridgewater. I had an aunt and uncle, Gail and Julia Merriam, who worked in the woolen mill in Bridgewater. And they were so much fun. They spent most of the time when they weren't working in the saloon, which was fun too. And I was in there, and I heard stories. And my uncle used to take me up to Chateauguay, the wildest part of Bridgewater. It's part Stockbridge, part Bethel. And there was a gold rush there in 1858. My uncle showed me the old mines, and we crawled around in them. My uncle was an amazing man. He was a dowser to start with. I'm a dowser. He was a really good one, and when people would lose things of value, they'd call him up, and he often could find them, you know, a wedding ring or something like that. He'd go and find them. And he could do amazing tricks. If we were having a party, us young kids, everybody in those days, of course, smoked. My uncle would inhale deeply as he could, and then his face would go into a strange contortion, and his cheeks would bow out, and then he would go, and the smoke would come out his ears. It really would. And he took me one night into the deeps of Chateauguay, and we heard the wild panthers scream. And then one night in the Bridgewater Saloon, I heard the story of a creature that roams the hills of Chateauguay called the Side Hill Cruncher. part deer and part wild boar. And it's been running those ridges so long, its legs are shorter on one side than the other. But nobody's sure whether it's the right side or the left side. But if you meet a side hill cruncher, don't run down along the hillside, just go up or down, because it has to come all the way around to get you, you see. In 1966, my first year at the Rutland Herald, I had 12 wonderful years there. I wrote a story about the side hill cruncher. And it set a record that holds today, the most letters to the editor. People wrote in with other names for him, you know, the side hill gouger, the side hill killer. Ooh, I don't think he was that mean. And amazing. And then in the 1920s, the Rutland Herald published a story about Bridgewater Center. And it was a very news-ish story, you know, about local people who, when the cold weather really came on, took the old people in the backyard and put them in a snowbank, left them there through the winter, dug them up in the spring, thawed them out, and they were fine. So they didn't have to feed them. I guess I would be of that age now. I could lose a few pounds, I suppose. But if it was in the Rutland Herald, it had to be true, right? Well, not anyway. You find when you're a reporter that most legends have some basis of fact, you know. And then there is 1,800 and froze to death. True lore. But first, the morning of September 6, 1814, a British army of 10,000 men crossed the international border into New York State, close by Champlain. Are you hearing me all right back there? Holler if I start to fade off here. 10,000 men crossing the border, marching south into the United States of America, were perhaps the finest soldiers in all the world. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. The decisive battle of the War of 1812 was about to happen. It had been a strange war, fought over trade rights, fought because the British were capturing, kidnapping young Americans and putting them on their warships to be sailors. Bad stuff. Now the British had come again against the United States as they had at Saratoga and Ticonderoga, moving down the lake. Oh, what are we doing? Am I at the wrong lecture here? I mean, Coffin's talking about the Civil War again. It'll tie together. Give it a minute. At Plattsburgh, 15 miles south of the border, behind hastily constructed fortifications on the south bank of the Saranac River, were 4,000 American men with rifles. Most of them weren't real soldiers. They were militiamen that had been hastily gathered up. And of the 4,000 men, 2,500 were Vermonters. We outnumbered the New Yorkers over there. And we dug in along the south bank of the Saranac River. The British went into camp on the north bank of the river, and there was skirmishing. Waiting close by in Plattsburgh Bay was an American fleet built the previous winter by Thomas McDonough, the admiral, down on the Otter Creek at Vergennes. The morning of September 11th, a mighty British fleet appeared off Cumberland Head at Plattsburgh, sailing before a strong north wind. Spotting the American ships, the British swung up into Plattsburgh Bay, and there, right in front of them, was a line of American battleships. The British had longer range, bigger guns, but suddenly McDonough had beat them already. He was right in front of him where all that power and length wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. And McDonough fired the first shot and knocked out a British ship. Bango, first shot. A heavy cannon duel began. Meanwhile, the British slipped most of their 10,000 infantry out along the Saranac 3 miles to make a secret crossing, but waiting for them in the woods were the Vermonters, and they stopped them cold. So there's a big sea battle going on in Plattsburgh Bay, and then out along the river there's a land battle. So McDonough fires the first very important shot. One of the early shots from the British smashed a cage on McDonough's flagship, sending the ship's pet rooster to the yardarms, where he crowed throughout the battle, cheering on the Americans. And then McDonough aimed another shot and knocked out the steerage of the biggest of all the British ships, the Confiance, 36-gun ship. And once the steering mechanism was gone, he couldn't spin around to fire his broadsides. He only had one side to work from. So the British got off to a very bad start. The British sent smaller boats in to board the American ships, but the Americans fought them off with pistols. And it wasn't going well for the Americans, for the British. At one point, an American ship ran aground, but they got it back in action somehow. A man on the shore who watched the battle said it was a bloody mess. But clearly, from the beginning, the British were getting the worst of it. And in an hour and a half, it was all over, and the British surrendered on McDonough's flagship, a very formal surrender. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the British signed the Treaty of Ghent, and the War of 1812 was over. An incredibly important battle in Lake Champlain. It ends the war. But the effects of the conflict would linger, particularly in Vermont. Partly in revenge, New England markets were flooded with British goods. An economic depression hit northern New England in the war's aftermath, as did an epidemic of spotted fever, which many called the plague. The post-war year of 1815 proved to be a tough one for Vermont and New Hampshire. And that autumn brought unusually cold weather, though the 1815-16 winter was a mild one. My grandmother, Bertha Minerva Metcalf Coffin, probably Kenny down here remembers her. Old friend of mine, grew up in Woodstock here. Bertha Minerva Metcalf Coffin. She grew up on a hill farm in South Pomfret. And she was a Victorian woman. She was a stolid person, and she was serious about things. But every once in a while, she'd remark on a cold day, "Oh, how it feels like 1800 and froze to death." And I would nod my head. I didn't ask her, the different way you did things then. So came 1816, a year forever recalled in Vermont, indeed in the history of the world. A mighty time of cold and darkness was coming to the struggling people of Vermont and to much of the planet. According to a fine book by Nicholas and William Klingeman, The Year Without Summer and the Volcano That Darkened the World and Changed History, the 500 years that preceded 1800 were part of a period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. New England had for centuries, from time to time, experienced very late and very early frosts. As the 1800s began, speculation on possible causes of the chill weather included an unusual number of sunspots. Also, suspicion turned to the presence on many barns of new and ingenious safety devices, lightning rods. Was Benjamin Franklin to blame for all this? Beginning in 1809, several major volcanic eruptions had occurred in the South Pacific. In 1812, two mountains exploded in the Indian Ocean. In 1814, one let loose in the Philippines. Then came April 5th, 1815. On that fateful day, a sizable mountain in the Indonesian archipelago blew its top. Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies that we now know as Indonesia. A series of eruptions sent ash and smoke 25 miles up and blew off the top 4,100 feet of that mountain. People 800 miles distant heard it. Estimates of the number killed near the eruption reached 15,000, and another 80,000 would perish in that area in the next 12 months from disease and starvation. Within a full day, a massive mushroom-shaped cloud, a portent of things in the Pacific. Remember we tested atomic weapons there? Mushrooms hundreds of miles high began to drift across the Pacific. Later research put the power of Tambora at 80 times Mount St. Helens. That's big. Glenn Darcy Wood of the University of Illinois, climate expert, in a recently published article, said the entire East Indian region was plunged into darkness. And she said the global history of the event is dizzying in scale and difficult to articulate. The volcanic cloud contained millions of tons of ash. As an historian friend of mine, Larry Coffin, who lives up in Bradford, also a distant cousin, has said a giant aerosol and ash cloud was suspended in the atmosphere, and it began to move around the world, reflecting sunlight, causing cooler temperatures and abnormal weather. Within weeks, spectacular sunsets were seen in Europe and New England. In September 1815, when snow fell, it had a red and brown tinge. As I said, the winter of 1516 was a rather mild one, though by long ago standards. And winters were far tougher, even, of course, in the days when I was growing up. Remember crusts? You could put a runner sled almost anywhere and slide almost any day, right? I remember when my father shoveled snow, he usually threw it up over his head. And who needed to make snow? We had too much of the damn stuff, didn't we? My God. 1816, much of the snow had disappeared by early March. Late April produced a heat wave. The estimable Vermont historian Abby Maria Hemingway wrote that this all brought on expectations of a fruitful season and an abundant harvest. In late April, some Vermont farmers began putting in crops as temperatures reached the 80s. Certainly with two grandparents who were farmers, I learned early on, you never plant till Memorial Day, right? Yes. I love that. The mildness continued into early June, but only until the 6th. That night, a blizzard struck. Throughout Vermont, snow and sometimes hail fell. Snow totals reached 12 inches and drifts 3 feet. In St. Johnsbury, Jacob Ide recorded frost and ice were as common as buttercups usually were. Some sheep that had just been shorn froze to death. Birds who could find no shelter dropped from the skies. In Stowe, it was recorded that farmers turned their cattle into the forest, where they found underbrush and leaves to subsist on, or they didn't. June 7th, James Winchester near Craftsbury said that his uncle set out in the storm for the sheep flock, saying, "If I am not back in an hour, call the neighbors and start them after me. June is a bad month to get buried in the snow." 3 days later, searchers found the family sheep safe inside a pine bough shelter built by the uncle. They found the uncle a mile away, staggering in the wrong direction, directly away from home, barely alive. But they took him home and thawed him out like the old folks used to do, and he was fine. In Danville, the North Star newspaper, snowed 20 inches on June 8th. Water froze an inch thick. It summed up the first half of June. Melancholy weather. The shoots of leaves of forest trees which were just putting forth, and corn and garden vegetables that were out of the ground were mostly killed. In Bennington, Benjamin Harwood on June 8th, sweeping blasts from the north, all for part of the day. In Heartland, Reverend Timothy Grow, he was about 65 at the time, wrote to his daughter on the morning of the night of gleaming, glistening hilltops as I drove over to No Town. Does that ring a bell here? It does, doesn't it? It's in Barnard. No Town in Barnard, right. A Hardwick man said, the forest leaves were all killed and the woods went in mourning through the summer. Seasonal weather returned at mid-June. Temperatures reached the 80s in southern Vermont. It did not last. Certainly Vermont was not the only place suffering. Buffalo, New York, reported some ice on Lake Erie. Cape May, New Jersey, reported 6 days of freezing temperatures in June. In the first week of July came scattered frost throughout Vermont. Then the weather warmed, but on July 21st, frost touched most of the state, killing corn in the northern part of the state. A vivid halo around the sun and sunspots were seen all summer long. What was happening? Below average temperatures continued in September, and though a tropical storm touched Massachusetts, there was little rain even in southern Vermont. Indeed, a Vermont newspaper on September 3rd reported on a 3-month drought. Forest fires broke out in New York's Adirondacks. Historian Crockett, after the June storm, the corn which had been sprouted again gave promise of maturing. But there was a heavy frost on September 10th, just as the ears were ready for roasting, which put an end to the hope of a late season. A Northeast Kingdom man remembered. James Gooding was so hopeless over the prospects that he killed all his cattle and then hanged himself. After vainly trying to make his wife do away with herself also, to escape the terrible and gradual death by freezing and starvation that he expected to be the common lot. Still no rain, and in late September, Burlington's Northern Sentinel said that the forest fires burning from Plattsburgh to Ticonderoga produced smoke that impeded navigation on Lake Champlain, and breathing began to get difficult. September 1816 brought fires throughout the Northeast. The Klingemans talk of smoke causing shipwrecks along the northern New England coast, where ships could not see other ships or lighthouses. The Windsor Journal said in October, the crops of wheat were generally good, but everything else has failed. And even this can hardly be converted into flour for want of sufficient water to keep mills in operation. In short, we are something like the soldier who had no allowance and no kettle to cook it in. Certainly there are food shortages in Vermont, but no reports of starvation emerge. Eating habits were revised. In the upper Connecticut Valley, the year 1816 became known as the mackerel year. Fish were brought from the seacoast to replace the regular pork supply, cut by the scarcity of feed. You know, you could get barges up the Connecticut at least as far as Wilder in those days. You know, there were canals around the falls. Fortunately, heavier than usual runs of fish came up the Missisquoi River from Champlain to Swanton. Large nets were operated day and night. People came from miles around, usually to trade maple sugar. Maple sugar. By the way, when the Vermonters went off to fight in the Civil War, they took maple sugar with them, and the Confederates loved it. They'd pay almost any price. Give you all the tobacco you wanted. A lot of Vermonters made a lot of money off that. I'm going down the wrong road here, aren't I? In Richford, on the Canadian border, the town historian said, the cold season of 1816 nearly desolated the town. Very few inhabitants remained by the end of the year, and people were subsisting almost on bread alone. Corn prices soared throughout Vermont, but in Bellows Falls, Thomas Squire sold at lower prices to keep people from starving. Still, a history of Wethersfield in southern Vermont said, in the vast fields along the Connecticut, William Jarvis kept huge bonfires going during the worst times and saved part of his crops. The southwestern part of town in the area of Kendrick's Corners was spared some of the night frost and matured a fair crop. It is to the credit of Jarvis and farmers of Kendrick Corners that they did not take advantage of their neighbors. They sold their corn at a fair price. A history noted, drawing on the parallel of the Old Testament, the land where they raised their crops became known as Little Egypt. And the brook was named Nile Brook. I think it still is. Vermonters, now listen to this. Vermonters cooked hedgehogs and boiled nettles as staples of their diet, along with wild turnip root. I never ate a hedgehog, but I did eat coon once, cooked in cheese, at a supper in Shrewsbury, and I just got out the door before I lost it all. Oh, that was awful. And here, I love this one. An account of Teignmouth's history stated that for the first time, people actually enjoyed oatmeal. In Teignmouth, some mills owned by Judge Nathaniel Chapman collected all the pumpkins and corn that could be found and ground them into meal, which was given to those who most needed it. That couldn't have tasted very good either. Now we go to Pittsford. Listen to this. In the 1890s, a local paper in Pittsford interviewed 3 old people who remembered well the year without a summer. They all credited a man who lived on what they call Corn Hill, which is now where the golf course is, I believe, in Pittsford. Because for some reason, and the local people said it was the way the winds came together, it stayed warm enough up there to raise crops, and he gave away crops. So they all thanked him. But all of these 3 people also agreed on this, that people in different parts of town at different times throughout the summer heard a noise in the sky and looked upward and saw giant cloud-like figures of a man on a horse, riding a horse and screaming, "Famine! Famine! Famine!" I don't know how to explain that. But I just found out about this recently, and I haven't had a chance to really dig into it. Not that I don't know how far I will get, but I do remember when I read this story that the first thing that came to mind was a hit song that came out in the 1950s, Ghost Riders in the Sky. Now, who did that song? Von Monroe, absolutely. Okay, there's one. Another one, Johnny Cash. And there is another very popular version of that. Oh my God, Ghost Riders in the Sky. Don't know what it was all about. In summing up 1816, Walter Cronkite wrote, "There was great suffering, but little, if any, starvation. As a rule, people helped each other generously, dividing the little they possessed with others less fortunate." The weather moved some Vermonters to write poetry. Here's one that came out of Wilmington a little after 1816. It didn't matter whether your farm was large or small. It didn't matter if you had a farm at all, because everyone was affected when water didn't run. The snow and frost continued without the warming sun. One day in June it got real hot and leaves began to show. And after that it snowed again and wind and cold did blow. The cows and horses had no grass, no grain to feed the chicks. No hay to put aside that time, just dry and shriveled sticks. The sheep were cold and hungry, and many starved to death, still waiting for the warming sun to save their labored breath. The kids were disappointed, no swimming, such a shame. It was in 1816 that summer never came. I think there would be room for Robert Frost later on. And here's another one. Came out of Berlin, Vermont. If God withholds those milder rays and sends us frosts and chilling days, e'en snow as late as 8th of June that nips the fruit in early blooms, shall we be frightened of such things? No, rather frightened of our sins. Now it takes a turn. The catastrophe of 1816 certainly was the most important meteorological event of the 19th century. People simply did not know the cause of all their troubles. If there were newspaper accounts of the Pacific volcanoes, no connections were made to what was happening in the United States. Indeed, no connection apparently between Tambora and what happened in New England and what happened in Europe, and we're going to get there in a minute, was made until the latter part of the 20th century. Amazing. They don't know why. Speculation intensified, and many saw and wrote that the hand of God was at work. Punishment. In the town of Berlin, former farm wife Mary Nye wrote in her diary, June 8th snowed this morning, and very cold, freezing the ground, covered with snow all things. And will not mankind mourn for sin, which is the cause of the freezing weather? In Bethel, work on the village's first church was hurried to completion for a consecration service on Christmas Eve. Let's give the Lord a present for his son's birthday. Maybe he'll back off a little. Also, a new church was moving to completion at the head of Church Street in Burlington. Still there, the Unitarian Church. Local farmers with very little to do, no crops to raise, volunteered and rushed to Burlington to finish it early. The Vermont History, Freedom, and Unity said religious enthusiasm declined during the 1812 war years, but a new revivalistic surge slammed into Vermont in 1816. The combination of natural catastrophe and financial disarray that followed the war seemed to be the cause. Now I'm going to take you just a little bit eastward, just across that river right there. You know, you remember when they used to call us the Twin States? You know, we're not very much alike anymore. If you turn us upside down, we kind of look alike, you know. But I had to give a speech 3 years ago at the State House in Concord on this subject, and so I came on some stories, just 2 or 3. That I thought were good enough to include in this, even though they're New Hampshire. Start with William Little, writing in the Town History of Warren up in the northern part. The war came, then 1812, then the pestilence, then the Black Plague, then in 1816, famine looked into our valley among the hills. A writer of the time said the whole face of nature appeared shrouded in gloom. The lamps of heaven kept their orbit, but their face was cheerless. One August day in Warren, the sky was lurid. The clouds thickened fast, hailstones rattled on the forest, and the wind shook the tops of trees. Suddenly it grew dark. Then in the twinkling of an eye, the hurricane leaped like a maniac from the skies. Howling, crashing, dizzying it came. The wind leveled a long swath of forest 20 yards wide, which seemed to have been felled by the stroke of some demonic fury, or to have prostrated itself as the Almighty passed by. Sounds like a tornado to me. Stephen Richardson's barn was blown down, shingles carried 2 miles to Amos Little's back pasture. Nathan Libby's house went unroofed and furniture scattered over the whole farm. But a looking glass blown 40 yards across the meadow landed on a stone unbroken. Oh! Fences prostrated, cows lifted from their feet, and sheep were killed. Autumn returned, alas, not to fill the barn with a generous thief, but the eye with the ear of disappointment. Winter came, and with it came almost starvation, save for the crop of rye along the shore. And that's the ocean shore he's talking about. Well, hear this from Newmarket, coastal Newmarket. Frost and cold all summer long. Crops have been planted once, twice, thrice. A killing frost every month of the year, no harvest. No harvest, it would be a long, barren winter. They thanked the Lord for the fish and for the tough salt hay of the lamprey marshes. They carefully hoarded little seed that they could for planting the next spring. Now, the governor of New Hampshire at the time was William Plummer. He owned a farm in Epping down toward the coast. He went about 10 times from Concord and Epping to Hanover the summer of 1816 for meetings at Dartmouth College. What's he doing going up to Dartmouth? Well, New Hampshire was trying to take over Dartmouth College. Now, I'm a Vermonter, but I did live in West Lebanon for 7 years because I worked at Dartmouth for 7 years. That's my school. I grew up going to ball games and everything, you know. Still go to their hockey game. God, they're good. Plummer was going to Hanover to fight the state over trying to fight for the state to take over Dartmouth. And it went on for months and months and months, this legal case. It finally reached the United States Supreme Court. One of the famous cases in the history of the Supreme Court, in the Marshall Court. And Dartmouth, very smartly, hired a young beginning graduate and lawyer to read its case, to fight its case, and his name was Daniel Webster. And he ended his 2-hour summation in front of the High Court by saying words that if you go to a Dartmouth reunion even today on a Friday night when they get in their cups, you'll hear them. He said to the court, "Sirs, it is but a small college, but there are those that love it." The tears still roll at Dartmouth about midnight. Oh, tremendous argument, won the case. But when, as the story we're telling here, Plummer kept a diary all his life, and he recorded every trip he made to Hanover, and he said that all that summer between Concord and Hanover, he never saw one live stalk of corn. It was getting bad. According to Vermont historian Louis Stillwell, in 1817, many residents left the warmer climates of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Great Lakes area. They left in droves, left for these areas. This is from Vermont and New Hampshire, to head for Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Great Lakes area. They left in droves, their farms sold cheap. They'd had enough. Something, it seemed, had gone permanently wrong with the weather. And when this coastal season piled itself on top of all besieging afflictions, a good many Vermonters were ready to quit. The historian in Hardwick said there were many emigrations from Hardwick to what was then called the West, but few went further than the Genesee Valley. You see, it's early in the westward movement. The vast area known as the Ohio country was opening, and some Vermonters headed there, and all it is understood that 15,000 Vermonters left the state in 1816, which is the same number that left the state right after the Civil War. But they went for a different reason. They'd been there, old men. They'd been fighting. They'd been off on the battlefields. And now they had to come home and work for the old man again? They got the hell out. And they went where the fields were leveler, and you didn't get a fresh crop of boulders every year. Yeah, they weren't fools, but most of them came back. Quoting the Langdon, New Hampshire town history, when the cold period passed, it was followed by a long period of drought that ruined all crops except potatoes, and they were only in moderate numbers. Some left the town for other fields of adventure in the great western regions they looked upon as a sort of El Dorado. Now hear this. This is big stuff. No matter how you look at this big stuff. One family escaping to the west was the Smiths, formerly of Sharon, Vermont, who in 1816 were renting a house in Norwich, of course just across the river from Hanover. The Smiths had a son named Joseph, born in Sharon when they lived there a very brief time. And then they moved for a time to West Lebanon, where he contracted a bone infection. And the head of Dartmouth's medical school, Nathan Smith, came down to West Lebanon and operated, dug into the bone without any anesthetic, and saved his life. And then they went back to Norwich, and the weather turned bad, and the Smiths were among those who gave up on Vermont. And they left Norwich for New York State to settle in Palmyra. Their son Joseph would say he found golden tablets, and a new religion would come upon the earth, the Church of Latter-day Saints. And I know that for some they are a controversial religion, but today they are the fastest growing religion in the United States of America and one of the fastest growing in the world. They've made quite an impact. And this all came out of that 1816 year. I absolutely think that it's fascinating. And if any of you here have heard my lecture on stone chambers that many people think were Celtic in origin, there was a stone chamber on the farm where Joseph Smith was born. And Professor Fell, who wrote America, B.C., always had a fascinating theory that Joseph Smith probably found that Celtic chamber on his farm, and then when he got to Palmyra, saw another one. And of course, the Celts did use gold, but we don't even really have any proof that the Celts were here at all. But anyway, it's a fascinating theory to look into. In Hartford, Connecticut, a Connecticut businessman from his office window noted a stampede of farmers bound west on the main street below that lasted 7 days. At Monticello in Virginia, an aging Thomas Jefferson was driven further into debt by a bad hay crop. And the Thomas Lincoln family, including son Abraham, packed up in 1816 and moved from Kentucky to Indiana. Of course, things were dangerous, dark, and scary. Why, even the governors were stoking the religious fires. Vermont Governor Jonas Galusha, late in 1816, issued a proclamation. The disposer of events is seen fit in his holy providence to blast our expectations in the latter harvest. We ought enter the courts of the Lord to ask penitence for our sins. In his inaugural address in 1816, Governor Plummer in New Hampshire references the need to appease God in a hurry. With the coming of 1816, a religious revival had already commenced in Vermont. Churches in Middlebury and Cornwall reported their greatest ever harvest of souls. And Asa Burton in Thetford, never was our church so full. So we've spoken about what used to be called the Twin States, you know, but Tambora eruption was a worldwide event. Darcy Wood wrote, 1816 was a time when the overwhelming majority of the world's population lived precariously from harvest to harvest. When the crops failed that year and again the next, starving rural legions from China to Ireland swarmed out of the countryside to market towns to beg for arms or to sell their children in exchange for food. Famine-friendly diseases, cholera and typhus, stalked the globe from India to Italy, while the price of bread and rice, the world's staple food, skyrocketed across a European continent devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. Tens of thousands of unemployed veterans found themselves unable to feed their families. They gave vent to desperation in town square riots and military-style campaigns, while governments feared revolution. The 1816 catastrophe in some way touched most of the eastern United States, at least causing discomfort and fear, if not calamities. That year, Congress voted itself a 50% pay raise. That year, American voters cast more than half of them out of office. That is democracy. In Germany, 1816 became known as the year of the beggar. Tourists on the continent mistook beggars moving along the roads for armies on the march. In June 1816, the writers Mary Shelley and Lord Byron went from England to the Alps with a group of English tourists, having planned a summer of hiking, scenery, and writing. But the cold hit Switzerland hard, and their summer was mainly spent huddled by the fireplace. Both wrote, and the weather had profound effects on what they produced. Byron composed a long poem called Darkness. Here's just one stanza. I had a dream which was not a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts went into selfish prayer for light. Wow, could that man write? Mary Shelley wrote home early in June from the shores of Lake Geneva. An almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I have ever beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines of Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our head amid the blackness. That stormy night, she first got the idea for her famous novel. Shelley imagined her Dr. Frankenstein waking from a nightmare to find his hideous creation at his bedside, quote, looking on with watery but speculative eyes. I began research on the year without a summer as the bicentennial of my church, the United Church of Bethel, approached. I gave a talk in the church that year on 1816, tied closely to the church's history. The building, as I said, was consecrated on Christmas Eve, 1816. And at the close of our bicentennial service on Christmas Eve, exactly 200 years later, we all went outdoors into a snowy landscape to watch a fireworks display donated by one of the members. They fired off the rockets and they burst over the top of the church. And everybody was cheering and all was festive, and all of a sudden everybody began to go quiet. And later they said they began to think about Tambora and the starvation worldwide and so forth. And everything quieted down. It really was quite an effect. In 1816, a great monster had stalked the seemingly fragile earth, and it was personified for many by Dr. Frankenstein's monster. But as we begin to close here, let us be mindful here in 2026 that a far greater monster than Frankenstein's, with a year without a summer, today stalks our planet. Global warming is upon the earth, and down the years will wreak far greater catastrophes than the famines and diseases brought on by the Tambora eruption. Let our thoughts, prayers even, go toward what even we few may do to keep this planet lovely and all alone in space, capable of sustaining a human life worth living. As 1816 became history, people far and wide gave it names. The poverty year, the year of no summer, the year without a sun, the cold year, the scarce year, the starving year. But in Vermont, 1816 was and has been remembered as 1800 and froze to death. But for all that, 1816 went out rather mild. But 1817 turned nasty. In February and March, in January, St. Elmo's fires visited Vermont. Strange light touched treetops, steeples, fence posts, even people's hair. Talk about fright. Today, there is no place to flee. As we speak, more mighty bergs are calving from the Antarctic ice sheet, and the ancient ice expanse that covers vast Greenland, oh, Greenland, is thinning and thinning. Scientists say that the melting of the polar ice sheets will raise the oceans to the level of Lady Liberty's torch, and it may not by now be stoppable. Monster fires, of course, have ripped through California, parts of Canada. We've got the smoke down here. Conflagrations in Australia and New Zealand are destroying animal populations. monster hurricanes, we got a break this year, will keep coming at us. Why not act now? Why not act now? We're going to act sooner or later. The quicker we do, the more effect we can have if it isn't too late. As I come to the close here are the final lines of Lord Byron's mighty poem, Darkness. As he tried, in effect, to perceive an end of the world brought about by a great change in climate. Hear Byron. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships, sailorless, lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead. The tides were in their grave. The moon, their mistress, had expired before. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. My God. Finally, one spring day, I was walking through the place I live today, Montpelier. Oh, it was a beautiful spring day, perfect, all blue sky, the kind I was dreaming of tonight. First, flowers were starting to come up. And I was happily walking along the street, and then I glanced at a car that went by, and it had a bumper sticker that brought me right back to the year without a summer. And this is what it said. This is what it said as the next day the Boston Red Sox were about to start a new season, and the previous one hadn't been very good. The bumper sticker said, "Nature bats last." Whoa. Now, I usually end my talk right there, but I'm going to add about 2 minutes because read this book, The Light Pirate, Lily Brooks Dalton. It was given to me because the Humanities Council is doing, some book discussions on this, and I'm speaking to a lot of these groups around the state, and I said, I'll read it, and I opened it up. 3 nights I didn't sleep until I read it cover to cover. It's a page turner. You can't stop. And by the time you finish this book, your whole perspective on global warming will have changed. But there's a great story that goes with it. It's a fantastic book. Having read this and gotten a little madder, climate change is real. Eventually, the waters are going to rise. The maples are going to die here. Miami, New York, Boston are going to be flooded. We have to act, yet we have a president who denies that there is climate change. Better do something about that. It is the biggest problem we face in the world today, unless he turns to nuclear weapons. But it is the biggest problem we face. Something will be done about it eventually. Do it now. If we won't do it on a national basis, do what little bit every one of us can. Drive a smaller car. Don't drive so far. Conserve what you can. Anything. We are losing the decisive battle we had just begun to fight. Thank you for listening.